Hello, everyone. I am your host, TaSh, and this is Women in Games International's Cheat Codes podcast. What does it mean to be a storyteller in the gaming world specifically? Yes, every game has a story with objectives, but how does it all come together? What drives that? So, to talk about storytelling in the gaming world, I have with me today Kate Welch. Welcome, Kate.
Hi, Tosh. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm Kate Welch. I have been in video games and tabletop games for 12 or 13 years now. I started out as a UX designer and worked my way through a variety of roles in the video game industry. Got hired as a game designer on Dungeons and Dragons and started leading writing projects and really found that was the thing that I liked to do the best. So now I'm back in video games. I'm a narrative director at a studio called Probably Monsters.
So, what does it mean to be a narrative director?
I think everybody has a different definition of that. It's one of those roles where I think that there's a lot of different titles in the gaming space for storyteller, and it's narrative designer. There's writers. Sometimes that's just game designers are working on the story. A narrative director, generally speaking, is someone who is establishing things at the very core of a story for a game, things like theme and tone and mood, and trying very hard to get everybody on board. There's a lot of interdepartment discussions, trying to make sure everybody's on the same page. So there's a lot of coordination, there's a lot of meetings. And right now at PM at my studio, I'm the only storyteller official person. So I am also doing a lot of the roles of a narrative designer, which is world building and character building. And I'm also doing the job of a writer, which is actually sitting down, writing bios and story beats and lines and cinematics and things. So right now, narrative director means a lot of things. Once I get a team under me, then those kinds of things will get delegated out. But for now, it's soup to nuts, the whole story creation.
So, what has been the best part of this year, big or small?
Best part of the last year, I think, so I just started at Probably Monsters at the beginning of October. And I think that was really exciting. The team I'm on, I really trust. And I think joining Probably Monsters was the best part of the last 12 months for me, because I am surrounded by really creative people who are trusting me to do things that I've never done before. Like the idea of writing a cinematic script for a video game, I've never done that before, but they trust me completely, and they've all got my back. We all collaborate so much. It's just a wonderful team to have been on. But probably the non-work thing that's been the best for me in the last 12 months. I really enjoyed. I got to go to Los Angeles and run a game of the new Oh my God. You know what? I'm just gonna put them outside. This is ridiculous. Hey, come here, both of you. Come on. Great podcast audio you two are creating for me here. So, get. Unbelievable. They have a sixth sense for this. How can we cause the most chaos in the shortest amount of time?
Right?
Try that again. The non-work related thing that I think is the most exciting in the last 12 months was I got to go to Los Angeles and run a game of the new Lord of the Rings role-playing system that is just coming out. There's been a few 5e adjacent Lord of the Rings systems, but this is the official Lord of the Rings role-playing game. So I got to run that and had an incredible cast of folks at the table, including Sala Baker, who played Sauron in Lord of the Rings. And for some pre-marketing stuff, I got to meet Elijah Wood. That was really cool.
That's really dope.
It was really cool. It was amazing. It was a total highlight.
I don't get starstruck much, but I think I would get really giggly if I ever met Elijah Wood. I think I'd be embarrassed. My face would be hot.
Yeah, I think I accomplished that on both our behalves.
It'll be hard not to. It's like we grew up together.
I know. He wears just the most incredible sweaters. He's got a cardigan collection that I envy, frankly, as I'm sitting here wearing a cardigan.
And he has a great smile.
He has such a great laugh. His musical little laugh. Oh God, it was a joy. He was a delight. The highlight of my year. Let me just a name drop that I meant running. It's adjacent to this wonderful storytelling thing I got to do for Lord of the Rings, which this is my Lord of the Rings tattoo that you can see here on my chest. Yeah. I'm a massive Lord. There's a lot of Lord of the Rings stuff in my life. We've got all the replica swords, the statue of Eowyn here. It's a big deal to me to be asked to run a story in that world. And so yeah, that was a really wonderful moment in my life.
That's really dope. That is awesome.
Thank you.
So, thinking back, we talked about growing up with Elijah Wood because now you're BFFs.
Yeah, something like that.
What was the first game you remember playing?
Oh man, I think it was and I think this is formative, honestly. I think it was the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy game for Apple IIc, like the text adventure game. Yeah, dude, this is ancient history stuff. But my dad had an Apple IIc that he gave to me when he upgraded to a better computer, and along with it came all of his games. And the two that I remember on like the big 5-inch floppy disks were Sky to the Galaxy and Bureaucracy, both of which are Douglas Adams, who was a monstrous impact on me as a child. Like the idea of someone who can write these stories so tongue-in-cheek, so funny. And I was just delighted that people could write things that weren't entirely serious, like the things that had silliness to them, and people would love that. And that became like a big part of my brand, I think. So Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and then my first like heavy graphics game was King's Quest 6, Air Today, Gone Tomorrow. I played the shit out of that game. It was my first ever of the Quest type games. And it was also very like tongue in cheek and silly, and lots of references to like grammatical type jokes in the writing. And clearly people had fun making that game. And I think that became a real touchstone for me, wanting to have fun
That's
making things.
really interesting. Yeah, that's a theme there.
It is. Totally.
That's pretty awesome. Before we started recording, we talked about Dungeons and Dragons. I told you that
Yes.
I'm on my second campaign ever.
Yes.
So tell me about what draws you into Dungeons and Dragons.
Ooh, what a great question. So I think that I have so many answers to this. The first time, though, I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, I'm starting to really see a theme here as you and I are talking. So this is very therapeutic. Thank you. But the first time I ever saw someone play Dungeons and Dragons is what got me, which was Acquisitions Incorporated on the PAX stage in Seattle. And this group of dudes playing D&D, and this was years and years ago. This is way pre-Critical Role, way before it was cool to do actual play. Might have even been pre-Twitch. And so I think that I saw these guys playing on stage and I was laughing so hard. I was like, I want to have this kind of experience with my friends. This seems like a blast. I want to make them laugh the way that these guys are making me laugh. So I ended up putting together a group of people from like work and friend, and like handpicking this group. I didn't Dungeon Master. I was a player. I was very intimidated by Dungeon Mastering, which we'll get into. But we had such a good time. We played, I think it was 4th edition for 2 years, and this was all in person. And so it was hard to get everybody together. But the fact that we even managed it is very impressive. We had a really wonderful time. And I was like, I love Dungeons and Dragons. And one of the things that I learned from this experience is that I don't know, like, I know rough details. I know what apartment I was living in, and I know what job I had at the time, but solid memories for me are hard to recall from that long ago, because this was like, I don't know, 12 years ago. But I remember the things that happened in my Dungeons and Dragons game really vividly. And so to me, there's a magic in games like D&D, any kind of tabletop game. I think this is the formula. I think the formula is essentially collective imagination.
Right.
When you collectively imagine something together and you're all contributing to it together, I think it forms real memories for all of you. And they might all be slightly different because like you're all going to see something different in your own minds. But those memories are just as real as anything that's happening to you. And I think that was my first indication something special is going on here, and I don't know what it is, and I got to dig deeper into it. And that just led me on this path.
As an adult, I feel like it's not many of us who give ourselves permission to be imaginative, and not just with work if you're working in a creative role, but outside of those things for fun. We consider it such a childish thing to do, to just explore our own imagination. And when you get a group of people who are affirming that, it's healing.
It totally is. I think
It's interesting.
There's something to it. There's something I suspect, and I feel like I've had this validated by people who are qualified to say, yes, this is true, anthropologist types. But there is a feeling in me that there is something like primitive inside of us that is nurtured by the idea of essentially sitting around a fire and telling stories together. I think that might be a part of like how we adapted as a social species because it feels so good to do it. To me, it's, and I don't know very many people who are, I don't know if I've got a selective group of people that I meet, but the people, I've never met anybody who's like, I tried D and it wasn't really for me. No, I don't, no one, it's, you have a bad dungeon master, that's a different story. It's really easy to be a bad dungeon master and that can ruin it for people. But with a good dungeon master, I think it's just like a human desire to be able to, as you said, pretend and tell stories and be imaginative in a way that like everyone around you is not going to make fun of you. Like you're safe.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
safe in that creative vulnerability. And there's nothing like it.
My background is in theater, and I've studied improv, which was highly intimidating for me. But something I took away from that is there is a yes and. And when you're around a table, even virtually with someone who, and there is this ongoing yes and within the parameters of the story, however, but that's ongoing yes and I feel more confident. I feel emboldened. And that's what I like about it, because not only am I having some sort of imagination vacation, but I have this constant affirmation and topping what I just imagined. And I think that's beautiful. And I wish more people gave themselves permission to do that. And I understand that I say permission in a way that doesn't forget that there is also a privilege that comes with being able to do that, because not everyone has those spaces, time, or the resources to do so. I understand that part of it, but I would love if people would not only provide those for people who are lacking those, but to give themselves also permission to do that more often.
I remember, this is all such good stuff. I hadn't even considered the element of privilege, but I'm like, and now I'm thinking like, yeah, you have to have the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You do have to have the basics met before imagination even becomes a need that can be fulfilled. That's such a
Right.
great point. I remember years ago, I feel like there was a big influx of articles about people who were playing Dungeons and Dragons in prisons. And I was so fascinated by this because I dug into it, and it depends on the facility. It depends on whether the wardens will permit it, because groups of people getting together time after time is conflated with gang activity, and that's not something that is permitted in prisons, obviously. So that's a big deal. You can look like a gang. It's also true that like dice for Dungeons and Dragons can be used for gambling, or can be like look like they're gambling, which is also a no-no. So there's a lot of hurdles for folks to clear, but some prisons, they understand, like some guards, some wardens, they understand what Dungeons and Dragons is. And like I was reading stories about some prisons that print out adventure modules to give to the
Oh,
folks who are
wow.
play, and people who have made dice like D20s out of toilet paper, like paper mache. Or I remember reading like they were doing their D20 by putting 20 slips of paper into a cup and then just picking out a slip of paper, and that was the roll. And so there are ways to get around it. But I was like, man, I really wanted to. I got sidetracked by becoming a game designer on Dungeons and Dragons, but I had written out the fake business plan of I want to start a nonprofit to send copies of D&D to like prisons, like local juvenile facilities, and hire professionals. I was in touch with therapists, people who do this work professionally with Dungeons and Dragons as a way of working with young people and getting them to get in and run games for folks who had never, because there's just so many emotional benefits and societal benefits to be able to play together in a space collaboratively and learn to like trust people in your vulnerability. There's just so many positive things that come
Yeah.
out of it when people, as you say, give themselves permission to do it, which is the biggest hurdle, I think.
Yes. Now, you mentioned that you were intimidated to be a DM. Why were you intimidated?
Oh yeah, because it's intimidating, man. Like you have to play every single non-player character. You have to come up with a plot. You have to respond in a yes and way as often as you possibly can. There's the constant paradox of I need to plan my session, but I want to respond improvisationally to everything they want to do. So I shouldn't overplan, because I'm going to be like really committed to what I planned.
Right.
But I can't underplan, because then I'm like, it's very intimidating. But the happy ending to this is that I did try to be in DM. Once I got hired as a game designer on Dungeons and Dragons, it was in my like 2-week period before I was starting. I was like, I've never DM'd. I should probably do that since it's a lot of the rules are around DMing. So I read the whole Dungeon Master's Guide, and then I ran a game for some friends, and I fell in love with it. It's my favorite role of the table now. I love it so much. Yes. I love, there's a power for sure, but it's not about that. I think a great dungeon master is someone who cares a lot about everyone at the table having a really good time, being a very empathetic person, being able to tell, okay, this person hasn't talked much, or this person's really responding whenever we like go into cool old cathedrals and they want to find reliquaries, whatever. You're making those notes. Okay, they're having fun, they're not having fun. How can I amp the fun for everybody? That's a good dungeon master. Someone who just like wants to TPK the group. That's easy to do. You're in control. There's no game in it. You're all powerful if you want to be. But if you are truly concerned about this table having a great time, you're going to be an excellent dungeon master. That's all there is to it. So once I realized, oh, I have that skill, and I love, for whatever, it's a social anxiety thing more than it is like a genius dungeon master thing. I don't think that person's having a good time. The feeling when you're playing like a song that you really like for someone else and they're not reacting.
And you're like, no? Okay.
No? Are you guys all, you not vibing with us? That's the feeling of being a great dungeon master, of giving a shit whether someone's enjoying the thing that you're providing to them. And so I really, and the magic, to me, the dopamine hit for being a dungeon master is when you have done your job so well that like you don't have to talk. They're all doing it for you. Like sitting back at the table and just like listening to everyone talking about this thing we've all constructed for 10 minutes without having to consult me at all. That's the sweet spot. You're not needed in that moment, and you shouldn't insert yourself unless requested. And so in that way, I get to like, in those moments, sit back and enjoy like a little TV episode of all these characters that I care about immensely because I'm a dungeon master. And yes, get my popcorn out and enjoy the ride. That's the best.
Love that. It's wonderful. In my first campaign, my character had a thing for very large guys. Our DM, their name is Kendricks. They noticed that, even though I didn't really mention it. So they played into that, and I loved it so much. It made me so happy.
Large guys is a very funny phrase. Oh my god. Oh, I'm so glad that you're playing it. It makes me so happy to hear from people who are like, oh, I just recently got into it. I'm like, yes!
I had to get over myself because I am not who I imagined would be playing that. But then I went to PAX and I went to the Norse Foundry, and one of the people selling the die was like, have you played? I said, I'm going to start. And she was so moved by the fact that we looked alike and I was playing.
Oh, wonderful.
And the fact that I could see myself in her and she could see, it was moving. I cried. Oh. And she gave me just like these amazing set of dice that I was looking at, and it was just so beautiful. And I boo-hoo cried because I never realized and understand that there is a weight. It's more than just me playing. And the fact that I never saw myself didn't mean that I couldn't be a part of something. And so now that I'm in it, I'm realizing it's important for me to be visible. And I understand not everyone can take that weight. But for me, I understand the importance in my visibility because now my son plays.
No, that's so cool.
And he brags about me playing, and it makes me so proud.
Honest to God, making me cry. Aside from, sorry, this is a question for you, but aside from, I'm curious, this Norse Foundry person, this angel, who I'm so grateful that she was there for you in that moment. Are there other people of color that you have seen playing Dungeons and Dragons as like a casual observer that made you want to play?
No. So I didn't think that there was a place for me until I was asked by WIGI, "Would you like to play in a learning game?" And it was with the expectation that I'm brand new and I'm learning how to play as I play. And so it took the weight off of me because it felt a club and a space that I wasn't allowed entry into. And a lot of that is automatic because there are spaces that I'm not easily allowed entry into. And so when that invitation was extended, and not only extended in the fact you don't have to pay admission to be here, you don't have to know anything, you don't have to have a background, and I knew it was safe. Now, that made a really big difference, having that safe space.
That means so much. I had sort of a version of that at some point. I'm not like trying to compare because it's very different. But when I was 18 or so, I was working in a coffee shop, and the back of the coffee shop was a bunch of teen boys, white teen boys, and they would all play Magic Gathering, Dungeons and Dragons. And when I would come back to serve them a drink or whatever that they'd ordered, they'd all get really quiet. And so for a long time, I had a similar feeling of girls aren't allowed in
Right.
this space. And so I thought Dungeons and Dragons wasn't for me as well. It also, I'm very susceptible to the way things are marketed. Like I had no idea how much I would love the game Diablo because it
Right.
was marketed at like a hardcore boy audience. And I was like, I see the packaging, I see like the demons and shit. And I'm like, it's just obviously not meant for me, so I'm not going to enjoy it. So I'm not going to even try it. And I love Diablo now. It's so weird how marketing can affect you that because it's all bullshit. It's all in my own
Right.
head. They weren't doing that, but it's definitely how it makes you feel. And so when you are in that situation, being excluded or feeling like you're excluded, it really does take a lot of time to undo that and to give yourself permission to try it because there would be nothing worse than playing a game like Dungeons and Dragons with a group of people who didn't feel like you belonged there. That would just be so damaging.
And this is why I have this 3-part series about storytelling, because I was suspicious of the storytellers. Because in so many stories, I am excluded. So if I make myself a part of this story, is it going to make me feel small? Is it going to take away from anything? Is this going to be a bad experience because I'm looking at the storytellers and they don't reflect me?
Exactly.
So that's one reason why I get really passionate about storytelling, especially in the gaming space, because it has to be for if I can fly, and while I'm flying, I could shoot bubbles out of my ears and these bubbles attack creatures. How are you telling me that creating someone that looks like me is not possible? How are you telling me that creating someone who doesn't fulfill the gender binary that you assume is not possible? So it's really important for us, especially at Wiki, to say, okay, storytellers, your mission is bigger. Your
Oh
mission is
yeah.
bigger than in the mirror.
So much bigger. So this is an interesting segue into the work that I'm doing now. One of the reasons I think I got this job was because during the interviews they were like, "Hey, a lot of us are white. You're white. We're all trying to write a story that reflects a lot of viewpoints. Do you go about doing that?" And so for me, and I had done this on Dungeons and Dragons, I was like, I don't think it's that hard to hire writers and consultants to make the stories that you want to be told from the perspective that they were lived. I don't think it's that difficult. I think there feels like there's friction about it maybe, but I did it on D&D. I continue to do it on this job. I think that's a really powerful message to get across to storytellers is that there are so many people out there that you can pay good money to who will help you tell your stories
Yes.
about different perspectives than your own, and they're waiting to help you. There's it's not that hard. And one of the things, and this is a maybe a touchy issue, but one of the attitudes that I face in gaming is it feels like a tangle of a problem that it's just white people who have this problem, whatever. But this is what happens. You're like, okay, I want to tell stories about people from a range of backgrounds, and they're all like, let's say they're all going to be fighters of some kind. And so like, let's talk about how we tell those stories. And so you're like, I'd love for somebody to be of this background. Then when you dig into, okay, what are some stereotypes that we need to avoid? What are the things that are like tropes that are overdone? That's not who we want to represent. We want to represent a different kind of viewpoint. Let's say just for a fighter, a lot of Western culture has demonized so many other cultures in like a combat perspective, like the idea of like the other, the savage. And so when you want to represent that viewpoint with this character who's a fighter, you're like, I can't find a single cultural background that hasn't been demonized for being violent. And so what you end up doing is, okay, I guess this character can't be from this background. And so that's the point where when you start to retreat into, okay, I guess this character needs to reflect me so that I can more authentically tell the story. That's when you need to hire a consultant.
Yes.
When you find yourself retreating from the challenge out of fear, you need a professional. That's my piece of wisdom there. I would love to hear what you think about this, by the way.
I think that makes sense because, for instance, one thing that I struggle to explain, but I'll use an example as becoming a hairstylist. If I want to become a hairstylist, even though my hair looks like this, when I'm going through training, I'm going on a hair that's straightened, that's usually straight, that's not my texture. And I have to learn by default to operate in both of those spaces in order to gain success in that field. However, the reverse of that, someone with straight hair doesn't have to do anything with hair that looks like mine in order to be successful in their field. So when someone comes to them, they have no idea. It doesn't even enter their realm of thought because they don't have that duality that I'm almost forced to have. So in those spaces where there are people in the room who don't look like me, it's almost impossible for them to think that there are any other perspectives or sides of the story because they didn't have to operate in those two spaces. And some people are willfully ignorant, yes. Others are just don't know what they don't know.
Totally. Yeah. I think one of the things that our society does a really bad job of recognizing is like the value of ignorance, maybe not the value, but the innocuousness of ignorance. Like being ignorant is not a crime. And I know a lot of people who are very protective of their ignorance. When they find a place that they don't know something, they feel bad for not knowing it. Like, how could you know it? You didn't know it. Like now, yeah, exactly. To me, that's a thing that you should be like, oh, I don't know. Maybe you are surrounded by people who do this, but I know very few people who, when they find an area of ignorance, they'll be like, oh, tell me more about that. I'm so curious. People just don't do that because it reveals a weakness or a vulnerability, or I'm going to make fun of them. What, have you lived under a rock your whole life? How do you not know about this? Of course, that's scary and probably has happened to everyone at some point, of that they've been made foolish for ignorance. But I refuse to fall into that. I think I have been that person before, and I'm 38 now, and I just don't give a shit. And I know one of the truisms that you hear a lot is, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. God, right. That's so true. Like the older I get, the more stuff I learn, the more I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much in this world. There's so much. It's one of the things I take into my storytelling as well, is I'll learn about a person, about a story that seems unbelievable, but is totally true. And I realize there's this line from Shakespeare, I think, which is, there's more in heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy. That's like my storytelling North Star. I'm like, there is nothing, I truly believe there's nothing you can invent that is unbelievable except a perfect person. I think that's the only thing. A perfect person doesn't exist. So as long as that's not what you're creating, everything else is on the table. And that's so lovely. But when you're ignorant of a lot of things, which of course I am, of course a lot of us are, there's no one who knows everything. This is one of the things I learned recently, which is like, no one person knows how an entire airplane works. That's so wild.
Right.
So don't feel bad about the things you don't know. No one knows how a whole airplane works. No one is an expert on every single system. I learned that from the social network documentary, social media documentary, that was like, no one person understands the Facebook algorithm. That algorithm's just doing its thing and is basically an entity, and yeah, it's not controlled by any one person. No one has a leash on that thing. Terrifying. But it also means like there's just a lot of stuff in this world that's not understood. So I think this goes back to our conversation about representation and seeing yourself and getting those backgrounds into your stories as much as you can. Don't punish yourself for your ignorance. I'm white, I'm cis, I've led a middle-class life. There's a lot of stuff. I am a deeply boring person, but the fact that like I'm curious, I think is what makes me able to tell stories. And staying curious, being a curious person is one of the most attractive qualities a human being can have.
Fully agree. Yeah, I love questions and I ask a lot of questions. So, one thing that frightens me I don't necessarily frightens, but one thing that I guess it angers me a little bit is as we are diving more and more into AI, we have not changed the storytellers. So, the storytellers who are there in the foundation of this are people who believe that there is a default type of person and a default type of thing. So as AI is building out more and more, it's based on the biases the original storytellers. And that angers me.
It should.
Yeah.
It's very frustrating. Yeah. That's such an interesting point. I've been experimenting a little bit, not in my main job, but I have a side gig and I'm writing some just like tropey fantasy stories for. And I've been using ChatGPT as like a collaboration. And to be honest with you, the reason I use it is because I can ask it for a story, let's say about a paladin, and I'll be like, tell me a story about a paladin that kind of goes this way. And it'll write me 5 paragraphs. And it is the most boring tripe I've ever fucking read in my life. And I love that because what you're saying, like, these are the default storytellers, don't want to tell their stories. I'm so excited that ChatGPT exists so I can read the most generic version that has been told a million times about a paladin and then be like, great, I know now what not to do, and I can be creative in my own space because I know the stereotypes that I'm trying to defy. And for that, it has been incredibly useful.
I support that. I fully support that.
But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I don't know enough about AI to speak intelligently about this, but maybe it'll just be a matter of time. Maybe as more of those voices come in. But AI is also, if it's scraping content that no one gave it permission to scrape, then that feels very, I don't know, very invasive. And then also if it's doing that and humans do this too, if it's doing that if it is scraping stories, let's say from people who have written from different kinds of backgrounds and perspectives, right? Let's say that what you're saying, like, it's these old school writers, these like old mentalities, there's one kind of person and that's all there is. If the AI was like, I'll start using other storytellers, but then I get into this question of is this so that white people can tell better stories off the backs of these creators that aren't getting credit? It's all gross. My brother studied indigenous futurism, and so I remember on one of my previous games, I was like, this like Joseph Campbell, the myth of the chosen one, and all of that is a very traditional Western mythos structure. And so I was like, is there another kind of mythos structure that is maybe from a different culture that provides a different kind of like catharsis in a storytelling? I just don't know. So I was asking him, and his answer will never leave me. There are, but one of the things you should really think about as you're doing this, and it's not to stop you, but definitely think about it, is what's your motivation for sourcing this mythos from these other cultures? Is it because you and a bunch of other white people want to differentiate yourselves in a market so that you can get different kinds of white people to buy your game, which is what the video game industry is. It's largely white. And so I've never forgotten that piece of advice. So now whenever I'm doing
That's a heavy question also.
bro,
I would have been in bed at night.
so heavy, dude. But it's another kind of piece of this problem of representing different kinds of characters. Yes, I want to tell stories from different perspectives. Why?
Right.
Because it's the right thing to do. That's the major reason. Because white stories are very boring to me. And so I want to learn more about other cultures and represent those stories so that other people, other types of people who don't get to see themselves in Dungeons and Dragons, for instance, don't get to see somebody working at Norse Foundry that looks like them. Like those kinds of people can like, oh my God, there's a character here that feels like me. That is, even if that is 0.0004% of our player population, that's the person I'm after, because there's a lot of content for white folks out there in the world. And I'm not that worried. They're going to find, they have plenty of games for them. So that is genuinely my motivation. However, one has to consider that it's also true that will be attractive to a kind of a white person like myself who is also looking for a different kind of story simply because they are bored of the usual stories. And while I think that like their heart is in the right place, it isn't out of a desire to like, oh, I want to get to know what an immigrant story from Korea feels like. It's just because, oh, this is a new kind of story that I didn't know about. And that's great. Right. But so all of these things, all of these things are like swirling in my mind as I'm writing these characters from a variety of backgrounds and making sure to involve the right people, to tell the right kind of stories, to do it with the right motivation in mind. It's a lot of work, but it is the right kind of work. Like it's the thing that you should do. Yeah. And it's going to be imperfect even after all this thought, all this preparation, hiring consultants, hiring writers, we're still going to fuck it up. So like we will be open to criticism on this game that will be justified, but we've done our best. And I think hopefully we will have set a new standard about how you do this work. So, okay, this is the next step, is that we hired these people, we got this information, we created one of my like shadow goals is I really want people to know there's a great deal of like opportunity and money to be found in this industry of like helping write stories that represent your background and help them understand, you can make a lot of money doing this. So that's one of the things that I want to do, is to make it very plain. If this is interesting to you, if you want to write for video games and you have a background that is different from what you're traditionally seeing in video games, there is a demand for your skills. So yeah, there's a lot of things to consider as you walk this road.
What advice would you give someone who's interested in being a storyteller in the gaming industry?
Oh man, there's a lot of advice. It really depends. It depends on whether they're going after like tabletop, like Dungeons and Dragons or similar games like that, or video games. I think that they're different but similar. So I'm mentoring this little girl that I met at a convention, and she came up to me. She can't be older than like 10. She was with her dad, and she was like, I want to be a writer for video games. I was like, great. Let me tell you about this video game engine called Twine that I think will be really easy for you and your dad to figure out. And then you can start writing video. And she has been sending me emails ever since then. She sent me one of the games that she's made in Twine. Like she's doing it. She's the only person I know of who has taken my advice. Which, if you want to write for video games, start writing your video game. That just Twine, for those who might not know, is basically like a text adventure engine that's browser based, and so you can write a little story and then have they open the door or they go down the hallway, and then you can click those options. Classic text adventure stuff, and it's very user friendly. So it's a great way to learn branching dialogue and like having to write for a number of outcomes, write a bunch of characters, and so much great lesson to learn there. She's been doing that. That's one piece of advice, is like, if you want to get into storytelling for games and you don't know where to start with an engine like Twine, or if you're more ambitious, there are a lot of other free video game engines out there that you can scale up to. But really something like Twine is perfectly fine to start, and understand like what it takes to write those interactions, what it takes to like make a compelling story that does have choice and things like that. Not that every video game does, but it's probably like the most difficult thing to do, is to have a branching narrative. So if you can start learning there, I think that gives you a leg up. For tabletop, my advice is similar but different, which is there are so many resources to create your own adventure content or character classes or whatever, and to make them look like official PDFs. My advice is always going to be go through the process of creating your own content and put it on the DMs Guild, which is a wonderful resource. The DMs Guild is, you can go dmsguild.com, I think, and it's a big community of people who are all making content for various RPGs. I think it's mostly 5e, Dungeons and Dragons, but you can put it up there for free, you can put it up there for cheap, people can pay money for it, whatever. But the best part about this is you can put it up in the DMs Guild and you're going to get a ton of feedback, hopefully, about your product. And so then you can be like, okay, this is what I did, this is what I didn't do, I'm gonna do that again, because it's just basically like a free user testing platform, which is the thing that you need when you're making games, is you need other people's feedback, because games are for other people. And so yeah, so that's, get your work published on the DMs Guild. It's easy to do it. You can make money from it eventually, but I wouldn't put that burden on yourself when you're starting out, because that is a surefire way to kill your enthusiasm for your product. But yeah, I think the advice is the same but different, and that is do it. Just do it. And that's really hard. I sense you are also a fellow creative. And so the motivation is the worst part. Like, making yourself do it is easily the worst part. Once you actually do it, you're fine.
I've talked myself out of more things than anyone else has. And I
That is
think just
common.
because it hasn't been done before doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done.
This is so true. This is so
It
true. If
stops
it
us a
hasn't,
lot.
I think we assume if it hasn't been done before that someone already tried it and it was too hard, but that means that it was just too hard for them, or it wasn't
Yes.
the right product. There's a book about creativity. Have you ever read this? It's called Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. Have you read
No.
this? Oh my God. It's my favorite. It is legitimately my Bible. And it's this short book about creativity, but every page has wisdom on it that I find just very reassuring in those times of great fear. And she has a bunch of stuff about how fear can't guide you. Fear is not allowed in the conversation. Everybody has this gem buried inside of them. But one of the things that I really like is that ideas are particles. I think that there are air particles and water and gas and everything in this world, but I also think that there are idea particles that fly around and they're trying to find a human partner to work with, to help realize them into the world. And I love this because it explains things like, oh, I had this great idea and then I saw that this guy invented it, and wow, that was my idea. And she wrote this book, Eat, Pray, Love, which I haven't read yet, but I want to, but it was a big runaway hit. And she had people come up to her, like book signings, mad, angry, because they were like, you wrote my book. This was the book I was supposed to write. And so she's like, I think what happens with idea particles is that they visit and you can work with them for a time, and maybe it doesn't work out. Maybe you don't work as hard as you should. The idea leaves you and it finds another partner to work with, or it visits you and you're like, this one's not for me, bro. You're gonna have to find somebody else, wrong time, whatever. And that happens to me a lot. I'm sure it happens to you a lot too. Those moments of, oh my gosh, I had the genius idea yesterday, going back to our conversation of AI. This genius idea, if I do say so myself. But the idea, I was talking to somebody, an artist, who's very frustrated that content is being scraped for AI's Mid-Journey to create art without crediting the artist that it's scraping from, which is going to be true for all AI. And I was like, what if somebody made a way to like tag images in the metadata with some kind of like spider crawling catch thing? So the Midjourney AI is crawling the web to get this source material. It hits your image. There is something in the metadata, and that like triggers the AI to pay you 5 cents, let's say. And so every time an AI scrapes your data with this metadata on the back end, you get money for that. And like, you can opt in, you can opt out of this, whatever. But that's passive income for artists. That's such an easy thing. And I think ameliorates the debate a little bit too. But I don't know how to do that. I'm so glad that idea visited me. I hope it goes visit somebody who actually has the wherewithal to do something with it. But that kind of shit happens all the time.
Yes. I also feel like being a creative person, I fight embarrassment a lot because I have so many ideas, and I feel if I say them all, because I'm not going to do all of them, I'm just expressing myself, people are going to be like, you failed. Like,
Exactly.
I feel so
Yeah.
embarrassed to be actively creative, if that makes sense.
Totally. No, I agree with you. I have this dumb rule. I know that if I have a creative idea and I say it out loud without having done it yet, I'm never going to do it. Because what happens with me is I'll say this idea out loud and I'll get the validation from someone around me being like, "Oh my God, that is such a good idea." And I'm like, "Isn't
Right.
it?" And
And
then
they're
the
like, "If you
cycle
do
has
it, I'll
ended.
do it with you." And I'm like, "No, I'm done.
Yeah,
I've
I'm
said it.
done. Now
I'm
I
over
express
it."
it out
Yeah.
loud and I was like, I'm not going to devote the energy to figuring out how to do this.
It's a lot.
No, I just wanted the credit from you to have a good idea. But that's, I think, what people mean when they say ideas are cheap. As the elbow grease to actually get an idea made is so much harder
Yes.
than actually just having an idea. So yeah,
But
it's tough.
sometimes those ideas, because I try to write, I have a dinosaur note. I love dinosaurs. So I have a dinosaur notebook and I
Yes.
try to write everything down. And sometimes those ideas that I'm not going to put into action are stepping stones for something else that I could totally do. But I
That's
need
such a
to
good
get
point.
that original idea out and write it down. It's still a constant battle to not feel like I'm failing because of that.
Yes. I know what you mean. I don't know that I have any good advice because I do think that like the creative struggle is, and this is controversial, I think it's necessary. I am married to an incredibly successful painter who has done, you are into Dungeons and Dragons. He's done a lot of the covers for Dungeons and Dragons. He's done a bunch of Magic the Gathering cards. His name's Tyler Jacobson. I'm obsessed with his work. He's unbelievable. But I am married to him. I live with him. We talk every day about creativity. And this guy who objectively, you look at his art, you're like, that guy should have no confidence problems. There is not a day that goes by where Tyler is not doubting himself, talking a shit about his work to me. And I'm like, it's spectacular for my self confidence because if that guy can't get through a day of creativity without fear, without worrying that he has failed, and you see his work, you're like, you've done this hundreds of times
Right.
very successfully, and he can't look at that body of work and be like, oh, I can do this. No, he can't. So my theory that I've developed after years of being around this person and feeling these ways myself is that like, if you don't have that fear of I'm a failure if I don't do this, or I'm not going to be good anymore, or for me, I think the motivation thing is tied to, okay, I know I've done this before, but this time I'm going to sit down, and if it doesn't happen again, it's dead and I can never do it again. And it was just luck every other time that I've been able to do this. Every time. And I think that's what kills my motivation is if I Schrodinger's cat this thing and I never know whether or not I still have the talent, then I never have to find out.
Right.
Instead I'll just clean my whole house. Like that. But I think that those negative feelings are the driver for us as creatives to continue to improve. Because if you're always struggling against yourself as the metric for whether or not you're still good, you will always try to be better. And I think that unfortunately, sadly, like the moment you realize, like, you're like, I'm good at this, I'm good, you're not going to grow anymore, and that's fine. But I don't know about you, I want to get better. I want to get better
Yeah.
until the day I die. I would just want to keep going. And I think that the only way that can happen truly is to just be afraid that you're a failure and that you're dog shit and prove yourself wrong day after day.
Yes. But still celebrate.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Oh my
I
God.
just for
Yeah.
anyone listening, don't forget to celebrate though.
Oh my God, please celebrate. Yeah, it's that I've started this thing where just the other day I was like, you know what I want to do every day? I want to impress myself because otherwise I feel like a loser. So I want to do something. And for me, that means write something I'm proud of, bake something that's delicious, tell one good joke that makes people laugh. Thank you, TaSh. You have checked my box for the day. It's been very helpful. But do something that I'm like, yeah, I still got it. I think that's
Yeah.
really important. It comes with exercise. It comes with watching my cats do something hilarious. There's a myriad of ways to impress yourself.
Yes.
But I think that is how you start every day. I start every day with fear and anxiety that I'm not going to get anything good done today. And if instead I'm like, no, I'm going to impress myself, I assume always that I'm a loser. I assume that from the moment I wake up. I'm going to be a loser today because that's just what my self worth tells me.
Right.
And instead, if I'm like, no, I'm going to impress myself, I'm going to show myself I'm not a loser today. That's been a really motivating factor for me. And then I know it's like dark. I don't want anybody to be like, start your day by thinking you're a loser. That's not what I'm saying. Please don't. But if you do, this could be very effective for you. And then at the end of the day, when I've proved to myself, like, I'm not a loser, then I do. I celebrate. And if
Yeah.
at the end of the day I'm like, nah, I feel like a loser, then I'm like, tomorrow's another day. Don't worry about it. And yeah.
I kind of relate. I had so maybe about 5 years ago, I was having a really hard time in life. My marriage was falling apart. We were splitting. It just I wasn't in a good space, and I started weightlifting. I started doing like every
Yes.
morning at 5:30 in the morning,
Damn.
and I was doing hard things. And so when my life was really hard in that area, because I had been so enmeshed in that marriage, I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I'd like to watch on TV. I didn't know what do I like
Mm.
to eat? What are my hobbies? And so waking up every morning, going and lifting weights, throwing around things, saying curse words,
Yes.
at the end of the by the middle of the day, when things get hard, I say, "You know what? I did a hard thing this morning. I could do hard things." And so that was,
100%.
like, my driving force. Even this morning, I still do it, but so I started that habit
Good.
then, but
Hell
it's
yeah.
just that when things got really shitty, I could say, "I could do hard things. This morning, I deadlifted 225. I could do hard things." So, it
Damn,
was just
girl. Okay.
but it still went back to me waking up kind of feeling shitty and feeling down on myself, and then doing
Mhm.
something hard, and then using that as a reminder that I could do shit when it gets hard, I could still do it.
Yeah.
So, I think that's how we are as creatives. You look back at the things you've done, you even though you're like, "Okay, I'm feeling really shitty right now," but look back and go,
Mhm.
"Wait a minute, okay, but I could do hard things. Look at this and this. Alright, so let's see." And it doesn't mean that you're gonna guaranteed to win. I've made a lot of mistakes over the past few years, and so it doesn't mean that you're not gonna make mistakes, but it could still help be the gas in your tank to push you forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Beautifully said.
So what's up next for you, and how can people find you in
Yeah.
the ether?
Sure. I'm working on this video game at Probably Monsters, and I'm super excited about the team I'm with. I have a rock star team. And so working on that, man. There are some Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop things coming up this year, but I can't reveal too much about them just because I don't know how much I'm allowed to say. But exciting stuff. And if you want to keep track of it, you can follow me mostly on Instagram, which is Kate Welch with four H's at the end, because all the other Kate Welches were taken.
From the bottom of my heart, Kate, thank you so much for doing this. I needed this today.
Too. Me too. This was really good, Tash.
And I know that other people listening are probably like, "You know what? I needed it too." They're probably talking to their speaker right now. I needed that too.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
good. Oh, I'm so glad. This is really nice, and I would really love to be friends with you. So I'm gonna email you after this so we can hang out.
Yes, I really enjoy it. It's been an hour and it
That
flew
was so
by.
fast, so
So,
fast. I just love talking about creativity and getting real vulnerable. I just think
yes.
it's the most important thing to talk about but in this space of
Yeah.
talking about creativity, talking about storytelling, to be able to be vulnerable is that's the only way creativity can happen. Like
Yeah.
if you can't be vulnerable, if you're not safe emotionally, you can't be creative. And so you do such a good job of immediately establishing that like I can be very vulnerable and safe. You're an interviewer.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so
I
much.
want to stick around, but I'm 2 minutes late to another, 3 minutes late to another
Okay.
meeting. So I have to
Am
run.
also. So thank you everyone for tuning in to Cheat Codes. I am your host, TaSh. Thank you to our guest, Kate. And to stay in touch
Yay!
with Women in Games International, please visit us at getwiggy.com. Subscribe to our newsletter. Until next time, bye.
Bye.